Hello everyone, I'm Sandra Young and I'm in Cape Town, South Africa, where spring is beginning to be felt after the chilly winter months. I want to start by thanking the inspiring Globe for Globe organising team, Gretchen, Katie and Claire, for the honour of this invitation to offer a plenary. And I'd like to thank you all for choosing to listen in, as I offer some remarks about the impact of wild adaptation on questions of environmental and historical justice. Specifically in relation to the Tempest, I'd like to argue that innovative theatre practice creates opportunities to imagine Indigenous modes of habitation and to conceive of a different relation to the earth. These are hinted at in the Tempest, but ultimately sidelined in Shakespeare's play. But recent appropriations of the Tempest suggest that theatre practitioners concerned with environmental and historical justice have found it rewarding to work with aspects of the play in order to prise open its fault lines, allowing audiences to recognize the threats of colonial violence and ecological harm that cast a shadow over Shakespeare's play. In my talk today, I'd like to talk about the tools that I found helpful in approaching adaptations of The Tempest, as I explore the ways in which theatre practice might facilitate public reckoning. The radical poetics of a recent adaptation in New Zealand offers a resonant case study of what Canadian scholar Mark Fortier calls wild adaptation. Called An Ordinary Storm, this work returns to the space of Caliban's island and gives voice to its unspoken archive of loss and dispossession. Described as, quote, a poetic meditation on the events of William Shakespeare's The Tempest, interpreted in the context of Maori culture, An Ordinary Storm explores Indigenous modes of inhabitance. For Caliban, as expressed in his opening words, barefoot on wet earth, and later describing his first watery encounter with Prospero and his child, I, that reef, where wave beat wave, nowhere to go. The work invites audiences to grapple with ways of knowing and being not accounted for in a colonialist imaginary. My interest in the imaginative work that unfolds in An Ordinary Storm is linked to a larger inquiry into the theatre as a space of public reckoning with slavery. In this new book project, I examine some of the many adaptations of The Tempest from the Restoration until today, which I acknowledge is a slightly unreasonable ambition, to consider how adaptation is implicated in the work of witness. I won't say more about that larger project here, except perhaps to give you a quick sense of some of the theoretical frameworks that have helped to guide my scholarly practice more generally, beginning with work that may seem rather removed from the world of Shakespeare, drawn from memory studies and archival justice, but then to go on to talk about theatre practice, eco-criticism, and adaptation studies. It has been invaluable for me to learn from what I think of as the new Black poetics and scholarly reflections on the politics of representation. That is to say, how to bear witness to violence through art without replicating what Sandra Hartman calls the grammar of violence. Hartman reflects on the challenge of working with archives in which enslaved people figure as banal numbers or, what is worse, in hateful prose, as per Prospero's characterizations of Caliban and Sycorax in The Tempest. For Hartman, quote, the more difficult task is to exhume the lives buried under this prose. Hartman finds reason to believe in the power of storytelling to disrupt the coherence projected by received history. That is to say, to imagine through story what can't be known. It is this unsettling confrontation with what remains unknown that Hartman recognizes in the poetic work of Song by Nordabisi Philip, an act of mourning and protest crafted in fragmentary shrouds from the legal record of the brutal drowning of 150 captives aboard a British slave ship in 1781. In her introduction to the recent 15th anniversary edition, Hartman affirms that Zong demands of us that we sit with the limits of what we can know, accept the unspeakable character of what has transpired, acknowledge what can't be recovered, surrender to it, be dispossessed by the enormity of absence. I've written about Hartman's challenge elsewhere, but for the purposes of this inquiry too, it seems important to heed the call of this poetics, to bring attention to narratives that disturb the lineaments of official archives. Scholars such as the Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird offer principles for disrupting what Bird calls, quote, the discordant and competing representations of diasporic arrivals and native lived experiences. Bird reads the Tempest askance, suggesting that Caliban functions as a kind of, quote, cacophony, a disruptive presence that, quote, unravels colonial logics dependent on binary constructions of settler-native, black-white, and master-slave. In their book, Transitive Empire, Bird proposes a reading practice that centers Indigenous remembrance, disrupting colonial temporalities and the rationalizations of settler colonialism, and using, quote, remembrance as a means through which to read counter to the stories that empire tells itself. Critical Indigenous Studies affirms that to center story potentially engenders a new relation both to historical time and to the earth itself. In thinking about how innovative theatre practice might help audiences to imagine the earth as vulnerable and home to its interconnected peoples, I have also taken direction from scholars who would be familiar to the Globe for Globe community, scholars who've worked with care questions of environmental and social justice in the work of Shakespearean adaptation. And so I'd like to turn to some of these examples now. In his epilogue to Shakespeare and Ecology, Randall Martin reminds us that Shakespeare's, I'm quoting now, greatest possibilities for becoming our eco-contemporary arguably lie not in academic discourse, but in performance. And more than that, he suggests that the particularities of place contribute significantly to a given production's capacity to signify. As Martin puts it, quote, actual or imagined environments are not decorative utilitarian backdrops for human-centered relations, but have independent agency and determining energies of their own. And these, he argues, help to generate both affective and ethical weight in performance. Sophie Chiari affirms the choice to interpret, quote, the climate of the island as a mirror of the geopolitical context of the play. She says, Prospero's island is an anti-utopia, where the sea is as rough as its political climate is poisonous. Simon Estock proposes ecophobia as a term through which to examine critically, quote, the constitutional moment in history that gives us the biblical imperative to control everything that lives. This is part of his endeavor to foster what he calls the activist possibilities of eco-criticism. But I note the tendency to slip into the first-person plural and find it regrettable. It assumes a shared culpability that masks the important differences in historical relation to the earth and to power that his term ecophobia itself seeks to name. Estock offers ecophobia in order to understand better the multi-directional relationship of dominance, in which a range of issues, which he identifies as ecophobia, racism, misogyny, homophobia, speciesism, are recognized as, quote, thoroughly interwoven with each other. And in relation to the Tempest in particular, Estock identifies what he calls a mindset of ecophobia, where, quote, the natural world is pictured as dangerous, unpredictable, and immoral, illustrating an ethics of dislocation from the natural world rather than one of connection. This is not necessarily true of contemporary reimaginings of the Tempest, I feel. many of which approach the work with environmental justice front of mind. So the willingness of theatre makers to denature and entirely reimagine familiar works has produced politically impactful adaptations on screen and stage. And increasingly, justice-oriented scholars are being asked to pay attention to provocative new engagements with Shakespeare. These works present a challenge to scholars such as myself to approach their works with openness and to set aside what we think we know of Shakespeare theatre practice. The Canadian scholar Mark Fortier refers to this mode of inventiveness as wild adaptation. And in a sense, I've riffed off of Fortier's argument in an early essay in Borrowers and Lenders, much of which is engaged with the emergent debates about what constitutes adaptation from that period of scholarship in 2007. But I find in his language a resonance that makes it especially useful, given his argument's openness to the more than human and to a planetary consciousness. He reflects on one particularly wild adaptation that centers a dog and suggests that, quote, Shakespeare here is, in the terminology of Deleuze and Guattari, becoming animal, crossing the cultural landscape in a different way, not by the accepted roads, not following the fence lines, but tracking what exists wherever through unpathed waters and undreamed shores. End quote. Fortier makes a case for understanding adaptation as, quote, quite literally, anything you can get away with. And he suggests that we might call this adaptation in the wild. Now, I'd like to appropriate Fortier's term, contributing to its celebration of disorder, another sense of wild as living in a state of nature, in order to address a mode of adaptation that we might think of as a kind of rewilding, innovative stagings that work with and against a given play, to elevate to consciousness the natural world in all its precarity and in its capacity to contribute life and belonging, perhaps also taking direction from Randall Martin and recognizing the environment itself as a character deserving of justice. In the time remaining, therefore, I'd like to give you a taste of an adaptation that I believe would warrant critical language of this kind. An Ordinary Storm takes the form of a series of extended poetic reflections by characters from the Tempest, offering a hidden glimpse into their imagined yearnings, their surprising affinities, their relationship of care to the world that they inhabit. The playwright describes her endeavour as creating an opportunity for each of the characters to speak for themselves, to, quote, without interruption, and to put their case, as she puts it, in the manner of a Maori tribal meeting where interruptions are forbidden. The work takes the form of a series of extended poems, each in the imagined voice or voices of specific characters alongside unnamed interlocutors. On the page, the main poetic strand is flanked by marginalia of translated concepts on one side in smaller font, and on the other side, a strand of what Elfick calls, quote, mysterious voices, sometimes the character's own thoughts, sometimes the thoughts of a listener, or what she also describes as whispers from shadows. These are characters who understand themselves to be existing in a living, breathing, natural world, a form of inhabitance in which Caliban's capacities and his ways of knowing are especially prized. As Prospero himself acknowledges, the knowledge that I had of herbs was useless. His sometimes saved us. Prospero's account of their life on the island makes visible his repeated astonishment at Caliban's skillful deployment of knowledge in sympathy with the natural world. His own, by comparison, is impoverished. What emerges then is a new understanding of the older man's impulse to denigrate the younger, and his own sense of powerlessness. For as he puts it, my arts are all external to myself. They depend on calculations more than spells. What they call paraphernalia were just my book, my mouse, my mantle. Without these, I am powerless. Magic is only what we do not understand. Though Caliban is demonstrably more skilled at survivance, Prospero himself recognizes that he and Caliban share an orientation to the natural world, both in the condition of precarity and in their desire for knowledge and mastery. For example, secretly watching Caliban catch a fish, Prospero remarks on, quote, his stillness and his focus and his concentration, something recognizable to me. In telling his story of survival at sea, he finds resonance with Sycorax and her child, saying, there was a kind of symmetry. We were banished, parent, child, and all our magic, as Sycorax and Caliban, just 12 short years before. What Elfick's Prospero is able to admit to in this intimate telling is not only Sycorax and Caliban's humanity, which I can tell you sets it apart from many of the adaptations in the 17th and 18th century, as I've discovered. He is also able to recognize their more learned and respectful way of living in and through the natural world, a capacity to which he owes his own survival. He acknowledges his own taxonomies are impoverished. There are creatures not known in any bestiary, and plants not found in all our herbals. And this Prospero is able to admit to his secret desire that Caliban find a way to forgive him his excesses, his betrayals. Not unlike Shakespeare's play, here Caliban's account helps us to imagine how this occurred. His mistake being too ready an attachment, too much trust, the willingness to share secrets of survival outside of filial bonds. My mother taught me knowledge, he says, that gave me power to live. I told him, and he turned it on me. There, what I did wrong. To trade that tribal telling, private word. What is so striking in his telling of in this telling is his own embeddedness within the elements through which he moves and the creatures with whom he travels, peppered throughout his narrative. The narrative's loose verbs signal a disavowal of rigid temporality. For example, when he offers us the chance to re-envisage his and his mother's arrival on the island through the water that carried them to the surface. I, my frog forebear, my mother, bird hunting, then up and up we fly, breaking that water roof, out where Ra leaned down. Caliban weaves the painful insight into his own naivete, into his story of the shared tenderness and then the betrayal. He tells us about his younger self. I think him creature of the beach that call the tide. I think him creature of the path that know the way. No, I am a fool, only the creature of the trick who play with magic. And then in a reference to Prospero's fragile manhood, he says, I watch that ear of him dangle when he do water. Man like me. This Caliban has been aware for some time that the emperor has no clothes. He is man like me. Prospero is no demigod, and even his powers over the elements are doubtful. One wave can drown island like mine. No, no great magic, not much more than ordinary storm. This tempest was an ordinary storm, as witnessed by one who lives in and through and with the natural cycles. Caliban's ways of knowing make him as vulnerable to exploitation as the natural world itself. His imagined inner life casts new light on the manipulations to which he has been subjected. There is so much more to share with you of the texture of this work and the effect of its vivid imaginings. We witness a mode of inhabitance in which the life force of the island itself, its surrounding waters, and all the creatures who inhabit it are shown to be interdependent in a way of living that is left broken by the rupture of colonial dominance and not to be easily repaired. Caliban's concerns are allowed to linger when he asks on Prospero's departure, will he remember me? Can the pataki, which is the flounder fish, return to mud he troubled? The aftermath of colonial occupation for this Caliban is not only his sense of having been betrayed and exploited himself, it is also alarm for the environment that has been desecrated, the mudflats so troubled that he doubts the fish will ever return. And so in closing, I have found An Ordinary Storm to be a rewarding work to explore in relation to the issues of justice that warrant our attention. I know that I am in good company when I say how helpful it has been to be part of a community of scholars willing to attend to theatre making that is Shakespeare adjacent, as we seek to recognise the impact of a creative practice that is deeply committed to the work of advocacy on behalf of those made vulnerable by exploitation. Thank you.